Making renewable energy happen. Nedbank CIB.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Powering Africa special. I'm Fifi Peters, and on today's show, we're going to be discussing everything that's being done by the way of renewable energy in South Africa and what can be done to both speed up and enhance the adoption of greener energy mixes. Now, joining me for today's discussion is James Green, who is chairman of SESA, the Sustainable Energy Society of South Africa, Mike Pio, who is head of infrastructure, energy and communications at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking, and Robbie Lowe, who is the director of Prometheum Carbon. Gentlemen, welcome to the Powering Africa discussion. By way of introduction, I suppose let's all just briefly highlight exactly what we are doing in the renewable energy space, just to get this discussion going. Robbie, shall I begin with you?
I'm with a company called Prometheum Carbon. We are primarily active in the climate change and carbon space, and as a result of that, we get involved quite a lot in renewable energy projects. So on a very broad level, we've been involved in solar PV projects, concentrated solar CSP projects, wind energy, and also renewable biomass. One of our latest projects is a renewable biomass generation on mining impacted land, and the use of that to generate electricity specifically for the mining industries and communities surrounding mining operations.
So we'll actually get into the details of that project in just a bit. But James, tell us about your venture in the renewable energy space, what it is exactly that you do there.
Well, Fifi, I wear a number of hats. I'm a manufacturer of solar water heaters. I sit as a member of the Council of the South African Renewable Energy Council, which is an umbrella body for a number of societies: SAPFIR, which is large-scale PV, SAWIA, which is large-scale wind, Sustella, which is concentrated solar power, and SESA, which I sit as I have a number of different roles, which basically is the end-user renewable sector, which is basically rooftop solar PV, i.e. electricity generation at home or in offices or factories, and solar water heating.
And Mike, you represent the private sector. Tell us exactly, as a member of Nedbank, what is the interest there?
Great, thanks, Fifi. So as a financial institution, obviously we're involved in the financing side of renewable energy. In the South African context, in the renewable energy IPP program, which the South African government has used to procure 6 gigs of renewable energy, we like to think of ourselves as the leading player. We have something like 42% market share. We have a commitment of about 35 billion rand to fund projects in that scale. And we are seeking to sort of roll that out throughout the continent as the rest of the continent takes on the procurement of renewable energy. We have led some landmark deals like the 300 meg Lake Turkana deal, which is currently the biggest wind project in East Africa. So we are really looking to expand the successes of what has happened in the South African context across the rest of the continent. On a smaller scale to areas that people like James are involved in specifically, we are really looking at financing models to do large-scale rooftop PV, the water heating piece, etc., trying to see how the whole sustainability piece can connect to the piece of property that somebody might own.
And talking about IPPs, James, you just handed me this. This is the latest news coming out of Eskom concerning the minister as well in IPPs. The minister saying that Eskom made a mistake by raising its corporate difficulties in relation to the signing of power purchase agreements. Just explain to us exactly what this news item is and what the implications are.
Well, after the first 3 rounds were closed, round 4 was basically entered into by around 38 different participants with the Department of Energy going back to August 2015. And those companies have been waiting to sign power purchase agreements with Eskom for wind and PV and other areas with an investment value of around 60 billion. So it has been a period of incredible difficulty for them on the basis that they were looking to get going. And as a result, Eskom, now having a surplus of power, has been very reluctant to enter into renewable energy when they're saying they've got a surplus of coal power which they can't sell. So they are looking for various different forms of compensation. Basically, what has happened today is that Minister Gagaba has come out and said that it is government policy, and Eskom's corporate problems are for them to sort out, and if they have a problem, to take it to the Minister of Public Enterprise, Mrs. Brown, and for her to take it to him. But the reality is that Eskom aren't really interested in renewable power because it's saying it's costing them money and they're losing sales on coal fuel power. Coal fuel power.
But then I'm interested, and Mike, I heard you speaking about this before we started the show, but how does the change of the ministry there now at that public enterprise portfolio change things for a private sector player like yourself who's looking to invest in the renewable energy space?
So I think the starting point is that this has probably been the most successful procurement of large-scale infrastructure anywhere in the world. I mean, the scale at which we've procured something like 90 projects has been quite phenomenal, and it's generally heralded by the rest of the world as an incredible success. So we have a huge number of international investors, and the only thing that international investors don't like in a program is this amount of uncertainty. So this problem has been rolling out for probably 11, 12 months now. We understand that the new minister needs time to apply her mind, to understand the issues relating to the program and so on. But all indications seem to be that Eskom will be considering this around the 13th of May, and that we're hearing that there is a board meeting on the 13th of May to finalise the budget quotes, actually the Eskom budget allocations that they need to be able to sign the contracts. So we are still optimistic that they are going to sign this year.
So it's all wait and see until that 13th of May deadline. But Robbie, you spoke about your involvement in climate change, and I'm really interested in finding out from you how the rhetoric around climate change, or the climate change denialists rather, and the rhetoric around them, we've seen it in the US with Donald Trump there, but how do you think that this is setting the movement towards renewable energy backwards?
I don't think it really impacts the move towards renewable energy. I think there's two things about renewable energy. The one is climate change and the importance to move to renewable energy. But the second is the economics of it. Renewable energy, if we look specifically at wind and solar, has had very, very steep downward learning curves. In other words, if you wait a year, your PV is a lot cheaper. We expect the downward learning curves, downward cost curve of solar PV and wind to continue, not as steep as what it has in the last couple of years, but still to have positive movement there. On the other hand, coal power is becoming more and more expensive, and so is nuclear. Nuclear has got a negative learning curve. Every time they build a new nuclear power plant, it costs more than the previous one, specifically for safety concerns. So you're sitting with a form of energy that is becoming cheaper by the day, and you're sitting with other forms of energy that's becoming more expensive by the day. And now we haven't even started talking about things like carbon tax on coal-fired generation. So the global move towards renewable energy, I think, is today driven much more by cost. A couple of years ago it was climate change, but today I think it's a cost move.
And nuclear, quite a topical issue in South Africa right now, particularly because of the cost implications, and I want to get to it, but before I do, I just want to lay the framework on powering the continent. Now, Mike, you did mention the investments that Nedbank is doing on the continent, where millions of Africans remain without electricity. But what do you think are the major setbacks to powering the continent, particularly driving renewable energy across the continent?
So I think there are two separate sort of discussions around that. The continent, we talk classically about 600 million people still needing connections as a sort of a generalized number. The dispersion of population and industry in every country on the continent means that there isn't one perfect solution. So to Robbie's point, I mean, I'm not a denialist, but what I do realize is that there is still a need for certain amounts of significant baseload power which can be constructed in a reasonably short period of time. So the PV technology is coming down and storage will arrive, but not at price points, I think, that can be meaningful to a lot of African industry very, very quickly. So Abuja, Lagos, Luanda, Lusaka might have a different energy requirement, but what is absolutely undeniable is that for people who are running around filling jerry cans with fuel, whether it's paraffin or diesel, to fire generators to give them light at night, renewables are presenting an incredible series of opportunities. When you build big-scale generation projects, you need to spend as much on transmission lines, distribution lines. We've never really been able to effectively have power pools in Africa that have really done what they do in places like Europe. So Germany switches off nuclear because it can take across the fence from France very, very quickly and very easily. It's a luxury nobody can afford anywhere in Africa, because we really only have a couple of powerhouses, being sort of North Africa and South Africa, that are significant generators that could export into the rest of the continent. We talk about pipe dreams like some of the massive hydros that have been on the cards for hundreds of years in the DRC. They don't happen anytime soon, and there is a huge amount of politics that needs to take place to make that happen. So renewables are, in particular PV, is something that can come in and power a village, power a small mining complex, a small industrial complex, very, very quickly and very, very easily. And firstly, the price points, as were mentioned, are at affordable levels, and the storage piece or a hybrid piece is going to make that completely affordable. So there's no one size fits all. South Africa has completely different issues to most of the rest of the continent because of our level of generation capacity already. I mean, we're talking about decommissioning plants, whereas almost every other country is talking about getting up to a level of capacity.
What should government be doing, or should they be doing more in driving this renewable energy? We've already heard from our finance minister saying that the government policy remained intact. Is this sufficient, or can more be done?
If one looks at the IRP of 2010 and the one which has been revised for 2016, there have been a number of studies done by the CSIR and others, and what is being pushed towards the DOE is the least cost option. And the least cost option basically shows that there's no need for nuclear at all, and that PV and wind and CSP, along with baseload from coal, is potentially the solution. There is one area, however, which is really omitted from a lot of the financials there, which is what the end user will do. And the reality is that if you can generate electricity at home cheaper than you can buy it from Eskom, or you can save electricity cheaper than Eskom can provide it to you, what will drive the end user renewable is when it's cheaper. And that point has arrived on solar water heaters, to the extent that people can now buy a solar water heater and have a payback in under 2 years. It will come with PV, so by the time we get to 2030, the probability is that a very large percentage of homeowners in the middle income and upper income sector and businesses will have embraced end user renewables because it's cheaper. And that's the reason people will do it, not because of climate change, they'll do it because of economics. So if one takes the overall picture of large scale renewables, which are clean energy, there isn't actually a benefit to the consumer in using clean energy, and it's costing Eskom theoretically, but all that's all passed through. Where the big saving comes for the consumer is the end user, you and me. If we can buy it cheaper or do it cheaper, we will. So that's going to change
Is this all consumers? Help me understand. Is this all consumers, or because the impression is that a lot of the consumers that go towards the renewable space with the solar heaters and all of that are generally your high net worth as consumers. So when you talk about cheaper costs, and your middle class, I mean, we're talking about the.
I wish it was true. There are around 7.2 million electric geysers in this country. And then there are around 5 to 6 million RDP homes on top of that which don't have hot water with electric geysers, and they typically use kettles or hot plates to boil their hot water. So there are two sort of areas. One is those people who are using electricity to heat water, and then at the other end you have the lower income in the RDP sector who are using an extremely expensive way of heating water in terms of hot plate and geysers. But in terms of the solar water heating rollout, which started back in sort of 2008, the government has only actually funded around 250,000 homes with solar water heaters in the low income sector. And in the upper income, or middle and upper income sector, the figure is actually tiny at around 150,000, which is less than 2% of the total population in terms of people who are using electricity. I can't tell you what the solution will be at the lower income because they don't basically have the funds to buy solar water heaters, and unless it is a government funded program, it's not likely to happen. But for those of us who are actually spending money on heating water, which is around 7.2 million electric geysers, they will progressively go for solar water heaters because it is much cheaper. That's how it's going to go. And then when it comes to actually buying electricity for your lights, you can, combined with energy efficient lighting such as LEDs, etc., you can actually take a large proportion of the house off the grid, but not your geyser, probably not your electric oven, and probably not your kettle, because you need a large load there. But PV faces the problem relating to storage. So, as has been mentioned, the price of PV has come down dramatically. Only 2 or 3 years ago, you were looking at around 20 Rand a watt. It's now down to 5 Rand a watt. So it's fallen incredibly. The price of battery storage has also fallen, but nobody's actually come out with the magic bullet yet, whereby it actually makes sense to use storage to power your lights at night, because it's actually cheaper to buy from.
What do you mean by
That's photovoltaic, which is where you're generating electricity through a PV panel, which is collecting light from the sun and converting it into electricity. The problem comes down to the storage area. It will change. Currently, if you look at the cost of the batteries which you're using to power the lights, and you look at the real figures, it's costing you around 3 to 4 Rand a kilowatt hour, and you could buy it much cheaper from Eskom. So if you're using the electricity during the daytime, it's very much cheaper than buying from Eskom. But if we're looking at the overall picture, the big magic bullet which is needed, whether it's on large-scale renewables as we've been talking over here, is the storage issue.
Storage issue, but then Robbie, not all renewable energy is a lot cheaper. I recall from my interactions with you, you were saying that bioenergy was somewhat a bit more expensive than your wind and solar. Perhaps you can just enlighten us there.
Yeah, it's not only the cost that's higher, it's also the scale that's much smaller. So if you look at bioenergy, you've got the whole range of people using wood to cook, all the way to, on the smaller scale, if you can look at, say, from 0.5 megawatt up to 10 megawatt power plants that run on pure biomass. And then, especially if you go into Europe, you see a lot of coal-fired power station being co-fired with biomass, where a typical pulverized fuel boiler like Eskom has got can be co-fired up to about 20% with biomass without making any modification to the plant. So I think the area of the question revolves around a project that we've recently done that's about a 2 megawatt power plant that will run on biomass that's cultivated for the plant. In the absence of concessionary funding and good power purchase of agreement, such project will not be fundable. But there's a lot of social issues around the project, and there's a lot of potential positive issues like job creation and mineland remediation that makes that specific project actually attractive for both grant funders, and once the grant funding is in, also for equity and debt funders to come into that project.
So a lot of the benefits there are from the projects potentially offsetting the cost implications. But Mike, I'm really interested in Nedbank as a private sector. Why so much passion and commitment to investing in this renewable energy space?
Vivi, will again, maybe two answers. Number one, the opportunity exists. The government set out a very, very understandable, bankable program 5 years ago. We were very heavily engaged in setting up the program with the Department of Energy, the IPP Office, the National Treasury, in designing power purchase agreements that would be capable of delivering this renewable program. So the opportunity was there. The investment, it's a very sound investment decision because we have policy commitment, or we always have had policy commitment. We've had a regulatory framework that allows us to do it, plus bankable projects. As a green bank, we stand out as a green bank, and our board has given us a huge green light to keep pursuing sustainable projects. So we operate in a lot of areas where sustainability is very important as part of the mix. That doesn't mean we would never finance a coal-fired power station, because currently it is part of the integrated resource plan. It is part of the mix, and there is no easy option for South Africa to switch one off and switch the other off. It's never a case of absolutes, that there's only renewables or only fossil fuels. But the original integrated resource plan showed a very serious commitment to dropping from 90% fossil fuels to something like 45% over the initial window, which was 2030, and renewable energy taking up that space. It's become a little bit confused with the political issues around nuclear at this point in time, but as recently as 3 weeks ago, we met with our then Minister of Energy in Washington, and she was absolutely committed to the fact that we would continue to roll out 1.5 to 2 megs of renewable energy through rounds 5, 6, 7 as part of the integrated resource plan. So again, there is a lot of discussion. The public debate has now been held. Department of Energy has to put forward a new plan by September. I would expect to still see renewables in that mix. What happens, unfortunately, with the complications around nuclear is around timing commitment. So I think renewables carries on. I think there was a very high level of acceptance at least at Department of Energy level to our climate change commitments. We regularly read in the press that Eskom is in breach of certain of its obligations under some of the money that it's taken from people like the World Bank by not lighting up more renewable energy. So I think the government is committed to renewable energy, and we hope that the integrated resource plan now delivers a program which is understandable again.
And James, you also made some comments regarding nuclear energy, you citing some comments that perhaps it wasn't needed in South Africa, and especially in our environment right now, where economic growth is expected to slow and Eskom is expected to remain with this excess supply of electricity as a demand for electricity stores. What are your impressions of nuclear? Do we need it?
I don't think actually it's really a question of whether we actually need it. What we
can we afford it?
Well, I don't think we can, but what one's looking at is saying that South Africa has a grid which is currently not that suited to large-scale renewables, but the amount of renewables which are online at the present moment is still very small. It's around 2,000 to 3,000 megawatts. So it's less than 5%.
Allow me to interrupt you there. Why is it that we have a grid that is not suitable for large-scale renewables?
Well, if you look at somewhere like Germany and France, France is around 80% nuclear, and Germany had some nuclear but was predominantly coal-fired. When they don't have enough baseload or they need to meet an evening peak, the great attraction is that they can import electricity from France, which is nuclear generated. So one of the attractions of nuclear is that theoretically you can stand on the accelerator or turn up the wick. Now, in South Africa, one of the things which we're looking at is gas power. Now, the great thing about a gas power is it's rather like a large engine, although it's generally a jet engine, and you can accelerate the amount of electricity which is needed for the evening peak. Now, Eskom's problems generally are not to do with the base load, but the morning and particularly the evening peak, and particularly in winter. And what happens in the evening peak is that people go home and they typically will make hot water, and they're turning on the lights. But hot water is one of the things which creates the big spike, along with electric cooking. Now, what that has the effect of is resulting in substations going down. So I'm not actually averse to nuclear, other than the fact that I don't think we can afford it, and other than the fact that people always disregard what we're going to do with the nuclear waste at the end of its life. and nobody yet has come up with a solution. If one is looking at the nuclear argument, it is going to be very expensive. Can the country afford it? Is it actually going to create many jobs? So if one looks at the job sector and you're looking at the areas which Nedbank are financing, there are many more jobs being created than people have given credit to. Now, recently we saw a number of the coal truckers striking outside of Pretoria saying they were all going to lose their jobs. And you can look at the number of jobs which are estimated to be around the world from renewables, which is 8.1 million, which was one of the things which DOE and other people looked at. In my tiny sector of the market, if we were doing 10,000 solar water heaters a month, it would employ the same number of employees as Eskom, around 40,000, just on 10,000. It would take 60 years to cover the country. So if one's looking at the renewable sector, they do create more jobs, more long-term sustainable jobs than nuclear ever will. And it is an important part of the equation in terms of looking at the training and skills for people, and the renewable industry has set up various academies so that people can be trained to go and work overseas. So jobs is a major factor which needs to come in. Nuclear is not going to create a lot of jobs locally. It's going to be very expensive power, and the chances are that renewables, in terms of large-scale PV, concentrated solar power, wind power, can actually be put into the grid, and it has been shown in Europe that they can actually integrate far more credibly than is being given currently at the present time in terms of the arguments that Eskom are putting forward. You have to remember that Eskom want to sell power on their terms, not necessarily in the interests of the consumer, but they do a great job in some respects of providing us with a reliable power supply now that we've got past the load shedding period, and we're not likely to have load shedding till 2022.
So much controversy around that load shedding and whether it was actually necessary, but we won't get into all of the politics.
And it could be entertaining to get into that. There was lots of money made by some people, I have no doubt, on selling diesel.
In terms of the consumer, the benefits of the consumer that James has been talking about, what would the ideal energy mix be for the benefit of the consumer and also the benefit of the community at large, considering the project that you're working on?
I think the energy landscape over the next 10 years is going to change so radically that 10 years from now, everybody around this table will have been wrong. The major things that's happening out there is the movement towards self-generation by small households and by large companies. We deal with the largest corporates in South Africa. They're all looking at self-generation. We look at what's happening on homes. Everybody is looking at it, even though people are not spending a lot of money on it. So the market's going to change from one where you've got a producer and a consumer to a prosumer market. The second thing that's happening globally, internationally, is there's a couple of business models standing up where you use technology such as blockchain technology, which is the basis for currency like Bitcoin, where people are trading electricity on peer-to-peer networks. So that's happening. Mike's mentioned storage. Storage costs are coming down. In between 3 and 5 years, the combination of the cost of PV plus the cost of storage will reach grid parity. In other words, you'll be able to generate during daytime, store for nighttime, cheaper than what you can buy from the grid. In some municipalities in South Africa, I think you can already start looking at achieving that, because some municipalities put very high markups on the electricity that they sell. So the landscape will change so fundamentally for everybody. And I think one of the biggest risks we run is if we look at an organization like Eskom, which the country needs to be financially stable. I'm not sure that Eskom understands the shape change of the market in a way that they can manage their risk going forward. And I think that introduces certain very, very significant risks to the market. Just maybe a quick comment on nuclear. Whether government or Eskom is involved or not, the country is going to go to a significant increase in renewable energy consumption, basically by people who build it themselves. The problem with nuclear is nuclear does not have a very fast load following capability. So if you are in a situation where you want to do load following with nuclear power, you've got a big problem, and you will need gas. Gas is the best solution to follow the load of rapid changes in supply or demand, and the supply changes would come from the intermittency of renewable energy. So it's not only a technical argument, I mean an economic argument to talk against nuclear. I think from a technical perspective, if you go into a grid with more intermittent renewable energy, nuclear also presents certain risks.
So, Mike, that was Robbie telling us that with or without government, the public is going to go towards renewables, and increasingly so. So from a private sector perspective, in terms of tapping into these increased opportunities as they unveil themselves, what would private players like yourselves need in order to put more money on the table here? So
the biggest missing part of this entire link, and I think Robbie's 100% right, I think we got a bit of a kickstart. The consequence of load shedding has kickstarted people to worry about the energy security as well as the financial sort of fundamentals. So the economic consideration will always drive people to decide to shift off grid. So the amazing thing about the integrated resource plan is it barely touches on this disruptive play that is arriving on an hourly basis. And I think people, I'm not sure if it's only Eskom, but I think many utilities around the world, or sorry, in Africa in particular, that we see are not considering the disruptive effect of people going largely off-grid or completely off-grid very, very soon. As a financial institution for us, I mentioned at the outset we needed some sort of policy certainty, but we need a regulatory framework in which to be able to finance things. If we develop a model which assumes that people will sell their surplus capacity back to utilities, whether it be City Power or Eskom itself, there has to be a regulatory framework which allows that. And there's still huge uncertainty as to exactly how you would do it, how it would price. Eskom will have to react to that disruption in its business model at a point in time. It can do that by charging different tariffs for different time of day use, or it can charge more for the actual infrastructure layer. You still need a connection into your house to be able to power up a geyser at 2 o'clock in the morning when you need to fly to the airport, because you don't have PV and you don't have possibly the storage at that point in time. But it's changing so rapidly. So what I think is changing the playing field for the banks is that the cost of the technology that is coming down, with the forecast of Eskom's electricity price going up, it means that the times that we need to be able to make a project financially viable are shortening quite dramatically, and that's something that the banks can take risk on. So we are looking at new models to finance rooftop PV. We talk about a model called corporate and industrial, the rooftops that are going up into shopping malls, onto big businesses, and that, I mean, James made reference to it earlier, it's happening at an incredible scale. We don't have a day where we don't get a request for a financing solution. If we were to regulate, that would open up an absolute floodgate, I think. James has pointed out that it can create a bubble in itself, because there is a lot of regulation. People can be selling the wrong solutions to people for the wrong reasons. But if it is regulated or deregulated to a degree where people could buy and sell freely, I think it changes the game. To Robbie's point, that disruptor will ripple through this economy in 5 years.
James, just a very, very quick closing comment from you on this discussion around renewable energy.
The answer is it's disruptive, and the reality is that you and everybody around this table has the power to change things. The problem that Eskom has is that they are a dinosaur model. They have a situation, as people go renewable, that Eskom is selling less electricity. They don't want the surplus power that we may generate through feed-in tariffs, because they've already got too much, which is why recently they've signed agreements with Botswana, Namibia and Zimbabwe to supply them with power. The more people that go renewable, both solar water heaters and rooftop solar PV, the less sales they have in the domestic sector, which is around 25% of the market. So with the large-scale stuff, which people like Nedbank are financing, that's going to put even more pressure on Eskom, which is why they don't really want to sign these, because they've already got a surplus, but it's going to happen anyway. So where the government policy is slightly difficult is that government is looking at the large-scale renewables, my end of the market, which is you and me. It makes sense to go renewable, and we don't have to have anything to do with the government, although maybe we may need to have something to do with Nedbank to help us finance it. But Mike is going to make it very attractive for all the consumers in this country to do that, which is one of the great benefits of this program. But the reality is that you and I have the power to make our own decision without worrying about the large scale, because we're going to benefit financially. So Eskom's future is very uncertain, because they're going to have reducing revenues, but they have increasing costs, particularly if they bring on things like nuclear, and the price of electricity is going to go up and up and up and up, and renewables are going to get more and more and more attractive.
That is not a very pretty picture that you are painting there for Eskom, and especially given
Eskom,
that it
but for
is
you and me, it's great.
But Eskom is a state-owned entity, and we know that these guys are in the spotlight from our ratings agencies, and we can't really afford any more disruption to them. But gentlemen, thank you so much for that conversation. We are going to have to leave the energy discussion there for now. That was James Green, who is a chairman of CISA, the Sustainable Energy Society of South Africa, Mike Bio, who is head of infrastructure energy and communications at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking, and Robbie Lowe, Director of Promethean Carbon.